June 27, 1980. Guglielmo Marconi International Airport, Bologna. Itavia's McDonnell Douglas DC-9-15 is preparing to make scheduled Flight 870 from Bologna to Palermo. There are 81 people on board the aircraft, 77 passengers, and 4 crew members. The DC-9 aircraft is operated by a crew consisting of Captain 44-year-old Domenico Gatti, who flew 7,430 hours. Co-pilot 32-year-old Enzo Fontana, who had a total flight time of 2,873 hours. 2 flight attendants work in the aircraft cabin. At 20:08 hours late, 1 hour and 53 minutes late, Flight IH-870 took off from Bologna and headed for Palermo. At 20:37 hours, Flight 870 contacted the air traffic controller and relayed its position. At this time, the plane was flying over the Tyrrhenian Sea near the island of Ustica. After that, communication with Flight 870 was suddenly lost, and the plane disappeared from the radar screens. At 2100 hours, 2 Italian F-104 fighters of the Air Force F-104 were raised in search of the Douglas DC-9 aircraft from the Grosseto Air Force Base. But, due to poor visibility, the fighters could not find anything. Floating parts of the wreckage and a body were later found in the area. None of the 81 people on board survived. As the commission later established, a flying plane over the Tyrrhenian Sea suddenly broke into 2 parts and crashed into the sea. Almost immediately after the disaster, a commission was set up to investigate the causes of the disaster. Investigators put forward 4 versions of what happened: technical failure, collision with another aircraft, defeat by an air-to-air missile, an explosion on board an aircraft. The technical fault and collision were dismissed after some time. But investigators could not figure out what exactly happened: a rocket hit the plane or an explosion on board. Since the evidence was in favor of both versions, the first commission issued a report stating that the crash of Flight 870 was due to an explosion of unknown origin. However, the relatives of the victims have achieved a second investigation. When the reinvestigation began, in May 1987, they managed to find the voice recorder of Flight 870. At the very end of the recording, the investigators heard the captain shout, "Guarda, look!" Investigators decided that the captain saw the rocket and wanted to inform the co-pilot about it, but some argued that he wanted to say, "Look at the artificial horizon." That is, the phrase had nothing to do with the rocket, if there was one. A fragment was also found, the edges of which were concave inward. Evidence of a clear missile hit. In 1989, the commission issued a report stating that the explosion was caused, presumably, by a missile fired from an unidentified aircraft. But, in 1991, the case fell apart when 2 Italian investigators, due to lack of evidence, withdrew their claims that Flight IH-870 had been hit by a missile. Subsequently, a third investigation was launched. One of the investigators, Frank Taylor, was alarmed by the fact that little debris could be collected from Flight 870. From 1988 to 1989, Taylor was one of the AAIB Air Accident Investigation Division investigators investigating the crash of Pan American Flight 103 over Lockerbie. Then he created a computer program that was able to show the location of each piece. Taylor decided to use this program in the investigation of the causes of the crash of Itavia 870 flight. As a result, investigators received 92% of the wreckage of the aircraft. After examining them, they found that there was a hole in the tail section of the plane that looked like an explosion. Investigators concluded that an unknown object exploded in the tail section of the liner, in the toilet. The explosion led to the separation of the right engine, and then the entire tail section. An explosive decompression occurred in the cabin of the aircraft. The uncontrolled aircraft went into a dive and about a minute later, spinning, crashed into the Tyrrhenian Sea. Theories have circulated over the years that Flight 870 was an unintended victim of air combat between NATO aircraft and the Libyan Air Force. According to media reports, there is radar tracking evidence that at the time of the crash, fighter jets from several NATO countries were in the same area, probably chasing a Libyan-make fighter that, in an attempt to evade radar control, flew close to Itavia 870 flight. In 2008, former Italian President and Prime Minister Francesco Cossiga said the airliner had been shot down by a French fighter jet. After the end of the third investigation, the Italian government refused to publish the report. In 2013, at a court hearing on financial liability for the downing of Flight 870, the Italian Supreme Court ordered the state to pay €100 million, $120 million, to the families of the victims. On April 8, 2015, the Palermo Court of Appeal dismissed the complaint and upheld the court's order to pay compensation to the families of the victims. There are several conspiracy theories that explain the crash of Flight 870. For example, the ship that searched for the wreckage on the ocean floor was French, but only U.S. officials had access to the parts of the plane found. Several radar reports were erased and several Italian generals were charged with obstruction of justice 20 years later. The difficulties investigators and relatives of the victims had in obtaining complete and reliable information about the Ustica disaster were popularly described as a rubber wall because the investigation was constantly deadlocked. On June 27, 2007, the Ustica Memorial Museum was opened in Bologna. The museum has parts of the aircraft that have been assembled and put on display, including almost the entire outer fuselage. The museum also contains items belonging to those on board that were found in the sea near the aircraft. But what actually happened on that ill-fated day aboard the DC-9 aircraft is still a mystery.